The ones that I looked at before I started doing the research, again, I used Miss Leslie, only a much earlier book, her 1828 book. And there
Did
was,
that become, Miss Leslie Eliza Leslie was a major book throughout the nation?
Yes.
And was she the Julia Child of her day? Were there other books that were also competing?
She had several books which apparently were bestsellers, but you see they went through several editions. She's one of the earliest American cookbook writers. There were a few others back into the 1700s, toward the end of the 1700s. But she was sort of, I don't know whether you want to call her a cross between Julia Childs and Martha Stewart. I don't know, because she was popular. She wrote popular recipes for middle-class homemakers.
And the middle class was rising at that time. That was really what Lincoln was getting into. I could put a second story onto his house. He was getting into the middle class. It was a different ethos. We need him. We need that today. Sorry.
But to get back to the gingerbread man,
Yes.
It's you see people think gingerbread man, you think the crisp cookie that we have at Christmas time, but I can't imagine either Lincoln's mother or stepmother in a log cabin, having space to roll out a cookie, having a tin cookie cutter. It just seemed unlikely to me. But in looking at Miss Leslie, she provided the key insight, because she talks about rolling this dough, which is like a children's clay dough, and forming it into beehives, making a snake-like rope and coiling it. I thought, well, gee, there's the answer. You just take, instead of doing a beehive, you just make a little man out of it, and that's what I did.
Yes, that's what you did. I can see that. That's exactly what we're seeing here. Then you also brought in, besides the gingerbread man, you had a number of cases. It was a jumble of cookies, and I asked what that was, and you said jumbles.
Jumbles.
So tell me, what are jumbles?
Jumbles are, as you can see, a donut-shaped cookie, and you find jumble recipes from the 1840s and 50s and into the 60s, and they all talk about forming a donut-shaped cookie. And this recipe, I was floored to find on the front page of a newspaper Abraham Lincoln would have read in 1832. It was the Sangamo Journal.
That's the Black Hawk War year.
Yeah, it was just, I was scanning through looking for other stuff, and there on the front page was this set of recipes, and I thought, holy smokes! And so that was the one I chose to make. And interestingly, that one has caraway seeds in it. Mm-hmm. Which is a thing that you see in some other kinds of cookies of the era. So it's sort of a cookie digestive biscuit sort of a thing, and they're really good.
Yeah. So how did the cookbooks of the day contribute to how Americans ate? If Leslie's was out there, did she really contribute to how the nation ate as food?
That's a fascinating question, and I think, kind of looking at the books, one insight that I had is in the addition, and you see them changing over time. So yes, you're absolutely right. She's reacting to how people are eating and what people want, and she begins to use more and more sophisticated ingredients. In one of the early ones, there's a huge chapter on what to do with cornmeal. And then that sort of disappears as you go forward. Miss Leslie, in the edition that Mary Lincoln had, she talks about cooking both on a stove and on an open hearth. You see some ingredients talk about putting the meat before a brisk fire, which of course means an open hearth. And so as kitchens were changing, as cooking media were changing, Miss Leslie did bring her cookbooks forward, and in the later editions there's not so much open hearth talk. Mm-hmm. But when I read it, it occurred to me that Mary Lincoln didn't have a stove until they remodeled the house twice. So when she and Mr. Lincoln are living there with little Robert and little Eddie, sort of two toddlers crawling around on this in front of this open hearth, that's what Mary's cooking on. And here's a woman who, as a child, was raised in an elegant home where they entertained all sorts of political figures of the day in Lexington, and a slave-owning home. So the sense that you read from the Mary biographies is that she was in and out of the kitchen, driving the slaves and servants crazy, as she herself admits, but she probably didn't have much of a hand in cooking. Whereas Abraham Lincoln is raised in the kitchen.
That's interesting.
And so he's seeing not only how the foods come in from the field, but seeing how his mother prepares them. And then after his mother dies, there's that period of time where he and his sister may in fact have been the primary cooks. Because I can't imagine that Thomas would have had time to do that. He would have been working in the fields. So it's, Lincoln is part and parcel of food, where it comes from, how it's prepared. And he knows so much that when they build the raft to go down the Mississippi River, he gets elected cook.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I wonder. So, what do you think he made going up and down the Mississippi River?
well, I think going down, they were probably, there's the month that they spent building the raft. So, cooking on a small campfire, probably things like corn cakes, corn dodgers, corn mush, catfish, whatever you could catch on the river. I think some of the women in town probably took pity on them and fed them a few other things. Going down the river, because all of the steamboats had wood up stops, there were little commercial communities that developed there so that the rafters could pull in as well. And my assumption is that they would buy milk and eggs and, eat fairly well, but simply on the way down. On the way back up, when they're on the steamboat, again, I'm assuming he's riding, what you would say third class, cheap ticket, where part of your responsibility was to get off the boat and help load the wood on at all the wood up stops. And those passengers would cook for themselves. But maybe he wandered down and bought a fancy meal in the steamboat kitchen.
Was there any evidence that he brought any tastes up back to New Salem from New Orleans?
I made a huge leap and thought a man of Lincoln's inherent curiosity would not have confined himself in the most complex port of the day, eating only the cornmeal and the catfish that had sustained them on the way down. So in picking a recipe to kind of tell that story, I used a New Orleans curry recipe because I think that might have been something he would have had if they were rooming in a boarding house. He was there for 2 to 4 weeks. Then by that point they would have sold the flatboat for lumber. And he had to live somewhere. So I'm thinking, you're living in a boarding house, he's going to be exposed to more sophisticated food. The markets in New Orleans were open air, and I'm sure he would have walked through them. It only makes sense. He was so curious. He wanted to know as much as he could know. It's obvious when you read anything. So I'm thinking he's seeing oranges, he's seeing lemons, he's seeing maybe berries. There would have been berrying time. He's seeing all kinds of exotic things. He's certainly, by the 1840s, when they're the Sangamon Long Nine and they've moved the capital, they're eating oysters to celebrate, and those come up the river. So it's kind of hard to tell. But I do think over his lifetime he was essentially a man of simple, basic tastes.
How did you decide which recipes to put into this book?
Oh, it was hard. There were so many cornmeal recipes to begin with. We could have had an entire Abraham Lincoln cornmeal book, but we sort of limited those. I tried to pick recipes that I thought would be ones that had broad appeal, that people would want to make, and that also could tell the story well. When we have the chapter about how Springfield moves from a small town into a sophisticated community with all of the immigrants, over the 10 or 12 year period, Springfield tripled in population. And it tripled with not only people coming from the United States, but you had a significant Portuguese population, a German population. There were free people of color. And an Irish population. You see in the census records there are young women from those populations working in homes. So I kind of touched on some of those typical recipes to underscore that there was sophistication there.
It's interesting that I've always argued that politically Lincoln was in a border state, and influences from all over were bombarding his area. So he was able to understand what all the differences are, and etc. Same with the food. You're saying that they were in an area with so many ethnicities and things coming from the South, from the East, from indigenous to the Midwest.
And you look at, if you look at the city directories, in the end of the 50s, you see there are restaurants that are talking about German cuisine. There's several beer halls. You see a couple of restaurants talking about food from Paris. special imported canned asparagus or something like that. I'm forgetting exactly what it was. But you see that it was not just a cornmeal, pickled pork, smoked ham culture. It was increasingly sophisticated.
Just because it's right here, I'm going to show this. Some years ago, we had this wonderful fruit plate from the White House. And this was from the Lincoln collection. And I'm sorry that I sold it just for money. But I can see, Lincoln, as you say in here, apples were his thing. And I'll put an apple right in front because I can see Lincoln using this for apples, maybe bananas. What other fruits did he like besides apples? Apples
were the big ones. They grew peaches. His father grew peaches on the Kentucky farm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the one you see mostly is apples.
Mm-hmm. So this could have been just filled with apples.
Just filled with apples. And of course, you know how he ate them.
Tell us how he ate them.
He did not eat them around the equator the way most of us do. He's said to have eaten them from the top down. I would assume he would have pulled the stem out and just dived right in and gone all the way down until there was nothing left. Ate its seeds and all.
Mm-hmm. Well, he liked his apples. That's a good thing.
And nothing left to throw away. I mean, he was an efficient man.